Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you for joining us. This session is for Georgia Water and Wastewater Utilities, and we'll be talking about communicating rates and utility finance with elected officials and customers. So how do you stand in front of the utility governing body and make your case for a rate increase? How do you communicate to your customers about what the rates do, where their money goes towards, and things of that nature? Next slide, please. For the agenda today, we're going to be talking, we'll have the introductions, we'll talk about logistics real quick, and I'll repeat some of the things I mentioned in the past two webinars about credit hours and so forth. My colleague, Stephen Lapp, will be presenting this information. I'll introduce him in a few seconds. My name is Shadi Eskaf. I'm the Research Director with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And this is one of three webinars that we're doing with GEFA. So again, back to the agenda, we'll be starting off with information about governing body and governing board members and what information they've been finding useful in terms of communicating with the utility staff on rates. Then some strategies about communicating the need for rate increases with governing board members, and then strategies for communicating with your customers. We'll end with time for questions. At any point, please submit your questions into the questions box. That way we can track them and answer them towards the end of this webinar. This is a 1-hour session, and Stephen will go over some of the tools and resources that are available to help water systems as well. Next slide, please. On the logistics front, we're using GoToWebinar. Again, please just submit your questions into the questions box. We have everybody muted, and we'll please stay muted throughout this call. At any point, if you want to open up the questions box even bigger so you can see what you're typing in, you can always click on that little icon to the right of the box, and you could pop it up and resize it and submit your questions. If there are any problems with audio with your computer, and if you want to switch over to your phone, just make sure that you're typing in pound audio pin pound, and you'll see that your audio pin in that audio drop down or the accordion part of your control panel. All right, next slide. We're presenting from the University of North Carolina Environmental Finance Center. We do a lot of work with local governments and non-governmental systems, water systems, stormwater, any systems that provide environmental services. We work with those communities to address the questions of how do you pay for these services, and how do you financially manage these services to be fair, effective, and financially sustainable over long periods of time. And we do that mostly through teaching and advising. So we work directly one-on-one with local government systems, with utility directors, mayors, elected officials, and answer a lot of questions about what can we do, and what are some of the best practices out there, and how can we address specific challenges we have on finances. So that's what we do, and we've been doing this for quite some time. Stephen will introduce himself. He's got a lot of experience working directly one-on-one with utilities and on communicating with boards. We've been partnering with the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority for a few years, doing several services, including surveying the rates, water and wastewater rates in the state of Georgia. We've been putting the dashboard, the Georgia Water and Wastewater Rates dashboards, which we presented on a couple of days ago. And we're providing a lot of these services. GEFA has funded these trainings for Georgia water utilities, so we're grateful to GEFA for covering those costs. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, this is one of 3 webinars as a part of a series of trainings for Georgia utilities. This is actually the 3rd of the 3. 2 days ago, we had a session that was focused on benchmarking financial performance and benchmarking rates. It included a demonstration of how to use and how to understand the Georgia Water and Wastewater Rates dashboard. Yesterday, we had a session that was provided by my colleague Elsa Marie Mullins. She presented on setting rates to fund operations and capital improvements. So there's a lot of discussion about thinking about your capital infrastructure and the costs and how do you pay for those and how do you set your rates for those. Today's session is going to be focused on communicating those rates and the needs with your elected officials and customers. So it follows the previous two kind of as the next step. So you've done your analysis, you figured out what your rates are, or what they need to be. Now, how do you get your elected officials to approve those rates? We have submitted each of these webinars as independent training events to be considered for credit hours for operators, for drinking water operators. And we'll find out by the end of this month whether it's approved, and we will follow up with all the registrants and all the attendees directly with some instructions in case you're looking to get credit hours for any one of these webinars. Next slide. So again, my name is Shadi Eskaf. I'm Research Director, and I presented the first webinar, but I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Stephen Lapp, who's a project manager at the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. Stephen, please come on and introduce yourself and take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Shadi. My name is Stephen Lapp, and I've been at the Environmental Finance Center at Chapel Hill for about 2.5 years. And a lot of my work during this time has been, like Shadi mentioned, doing that one-on-one technical assistance with small water systems around the country and helping them better understand their affordability and financial positions, as well as doing some rate analysis and helping them project different rate scenarios. I have also have some work in different topics of affordability as well as regionalization. So today, we'll kind of break the session into a couple of parts. So first, we'll focus on more of the elected officials and governing board side of things. So we'll go over in this first session some information that governing board members might find useful, and some strategies to communicate the need for rate increases with those governing board members. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about some of the customer side of things. Some of the information will be transferable to customers as well, but we'll start here first with the governing board side of things. So back in 2014, we were a part of a survey and some research with the Water Research Foundation and ICMA, doing a survey on some water system rate communication. So a lot of that information that was coming from that survey is very relevant to today's conversation. So we want to kind of start with some interesting findings there as we kind of frame our conversation around communicating rates. So for that survey, we talked with different chief administrative officers and chief elected officials from city and county systems, anyone that was setting and managing water system rates. You can see here the breakdown of those things. Some of those folks overlapped, where there were both administrative officers and elected officials from those governmental systems. So we got quite a bit of information. And the survey was essentially trying to identify the most important factors and information shared regarding the most recent rate increase request, as well as trying to identify the most effective methods of communicating the need for the rate increase. So one of the first things that we wanted to ask was, are rates getting approved? And so, the survey of over 1,300 folks, we got the requests, or we got the results back, and for the most part, yes. So 90% got a rate increase approved. So that is great. So that's the overwhelming majority of folks. So once we kind of asked, are the rates getting approved, we wanted to know a little bit more information. So we wanted to kind of ask what was approved versus what was requested. So the distribution of what chief administrative officers got versus what they requested. So this graph reflects the amount that they got versus what they requested, and you can see here that we have the breakdowns into some buckets, ranging from 0 to or below 0 to above 100%. And you can see that for the most part, a lot of folks got essentially what they asked for. So that 91 to 100% of the requested rate increase was what kind of went through. So that is really important to see. Kind of, we do see that some folks got that 0. So 5% of folks did not get what that was requested, so it was not approved. You do see some small percentages at 61 to 70%, that 1% there. There's a couple ones that are below 1% in the 41 to 50, in the 71 to 80%, and then there's also a 1% that got more than they requested. So those are probably some of the luckier folks, but for the most part, at 91 to 100% is pretty good. And so that was looking at about a little over 800 folks were in that response for that survey question. So now we'll ask the first poll. So think back during maybe your last rate request, or if you are not a part of a system and you're a technical service provider, or you've worked with a system in the past, think about maybe the last time that you were going through a rate request. What percentage of was approved from what you requested? So Shadi, do we have that poll running?
We have it running right now, and majority have responded, but we'll give a few more seconds. Again, just think about the last time that you had a rate request, and even if it was this year with COVID, did your boards fully approve it, approve a portion of it, or none at all? Okay, we will close things out in 5 more seconds. Okay, here are the results. Can you see them, Stephen?
I see those now, yes. So it looks like, a good portion of you all, did get that full amount. So over half of you all got that full amount. And it does look like there were some that got less than that full amount. So that is good to know, and probably, what we kind of would expect. We do know that not every request goes through at that full amount. So thank you all for participating in that first poll. So, once we kind of have that conversation about what was approved versus what was requested, then the kind of conversation takes that next step. Did they ask, was the request asking for enough? So we asked a question, in your professional opinion, which statement below describes the water rate increase that was proposed to the local government governing body for approval? So we had some responses that they could use. So below what was needed to maintain basic operating needs, sufficient to address basic utility / department obligations, but not most capital needs, provided revenues to maintain a strong fiscal condition and meet most capital needs, beyond what is needed in the coming year to help avoid another rate increase for a few years, and then we had other. So we can see here just the breakdown of what people were asking for and how that was or was not meeting their needs. For the first off, you can see here 37% of folks were able to get, they're asking for rates to meet, their day-to-day operations, but not all of their, or not most of their capital needs. So, perhaps they're deferring some of those projects into the future. And then even beyond that, we have,
sorry to interrupt you, but for some reason, I don't see your full screen. I just see like a zoomed in portion of your slides. You might want to unshare your slides and share them again, or close out the full screen and come back up again.
Okay, one moment.
Sorry about that. It might be easiest if you just reshare, close your share and then come back up again.
Did that fix things?
That did, thank you.
Okay. So we can go back here. So, 37% of folks were asking for rates that were, meeting the kind of basic utility, operations, but not most of their capital needs. So maybe they're having to defer some capital projects. And then the more, beyond that, we found, 8% of folks, the rates that they were requesting were below what was needed to maintain basic operating needs. So, in that case, they were keeping essentially rates artificially low and perhaps having to be subsidized by a general fund or spending down some of their reserves instead of increasing rates to meet some of those needs. And those kind of two that we highlighted there are probably the more concerning responses. And we will kind of talk about maybe some ways in which some tools that we can use to address how to better have that conversation with the elected officials and decision makers about how to talk about rates in a way that you can maybe get what you need for both your operating, the money for your operations, as well as for future capital needs. So the study also found that some key factors for effectively communicating a rate request included, trust in creating a working relationship with the governing body, as well as including some proper information. So there's some key information that we'll talk about that is important to include, as well as having some public involvement in the rate conversation. And that portion we'll kind of get to a little bit more when we talk about the customer side of things. But we'll address the first two next. So, according to administrative officers, the working relationship with the governing body was not related to the size of the governing body or whether or not a rate adjustment was approved by the governing body. However, the administrative officers with a better working relationship with the governing body were more likely to request higher rate increases, and they're more likely to request full cost recovery rate increases. So you all might have, some of you all that tuned into some of the previous webinars, when you're talking about some rate setting objectives, full cost recovery, meaning that you're not only including, you're not only covering your operations, but you're also covering your debt service, you're covering, future capital needs, source water protection, and anything and everything that you kind of can think of to maintain financially sustainable operations there. So, also according to elected officials, more frequent communication and more effective communication are directly related to a good working relationship. And so, we kind of wanted to know, how often does the full governing body typically meet with staff? If, frequent and effective communication is important for this process, we wanted to know, is this actually happening? So we allowed for people to respond, every 1 to 2 months, every 3 months, every 4 to 6 months, about once a year, or not every year. And you can see those bottom two, about once a year and not every year, makes up just above 50% of the folks. So less than half of people are meeting with their governing board more than once per year. And so we just saw that effective communication is important, and that frequent communication is important for building a strong relationship with those governing bodies. So we will ask another poll. So think about the last time you spoke with your governing board members, and think about how often that process occurs for you all in your system, in your community, or if you're maybe a service provider, a technical service provider, think about a system that you work with, and did they have a lot of conversation with their board? And if so, did that lead to more trust and more successful rate requests? Or maybe they didn't have a successful rate request. Think about maybe if there was less communication between them. So take a little bit of time to answer that poll.
Okay, we're getting a good response. Not quite as high as last time, but just give me a few more seconds. Thank you, folks, for responding. This is probably good. I'm going to stop it now and share the results. Okay, so 48% of you all about every month, 9% every quarter, 17% once a year or even less. So it sounds like about half of you all have some monthly meetings that at least can help build that relationship and that kind of working relationship, and have a regular basis to communicate with each other. So that is helpful. That is helpful to know. Shadi, how's my screen looking? Do I need to reshare? No, it's looking fine now. And I was told by one of the attendees that maybe it was just me that was not seeing it correctly because they were seeing it fine. So I apologize for the interruption, everybody, but please carry on.
All right. Well, we will keep on going. So, that second piece that was a key factor for a successful rate request and successful rate communication was, key information conveyed to governing boards. So we asked system managers what information was shared with the governing board, and we found that there are a lot of commonalities among the systems that were surveyed. So we had things like, customer impacts of the rate, the impact of the rate increase on customers, different financial information, what the need for the rate increase was, rate comparisons, and then the customer feedbacks on how they're doing. And so you can see just a variety of information that can be shared with governing boards, right? So out of those things, what is most useful? And you might have a better understanding with your governing board if you've been working with them for a while. You might know so-and-so likes to always know X, Y, and Z about a rate increase or about the financials. But perhaps, maybe you don't have that just yet. So we asked the governing board members in the survey what information was most useful in their decision to either support or not support the rate increase. And so what we found was, you can see the highlighted, the highlighted pieces of information are the pieces of information that were reported by governing boards as the most helpful. So you can see here how much the average bill would change. So what the impact would be of the rate increase, anticipated capital expenses, the financial condition of the water utility, comparisons of rates with other utilities, bond covenants, and customer satisfaction surveys. And so we'll kind of talk a little bit about why some of this information is important to convey, and maybe some ways in which you can share some of this information. So first, we'll talk about anticipated capital expenses. So this is just a screenshot of one of our tools, the water rates analysis tool. And so it essentially just takes rates and some information about usage and expenses to project rates into the future. So you can see here those bars, that peach and the purplish blue bars are the revenues for the water system, where that dotted red line is the aggregated expenses, so the debt service and the operating expenses and those sorts of things. So looking at just in the short term, it looks like you have enough revenue to meet your expenses. So if you're looking at just the short term, someone might say, why do we need a rate increase? But if you have some capital expenses, maybe you have a capital improvement plan that looks at a 5-year window or a 10-year window, or you can project some of those expenses in one way or the other, you can see that need maybe in the future. Maybe you have some needs coming up and you might have to take out a loan and finance that project, and that would raise your expenses, obviously. So if you can have that foresight to look at anticipated capital expenses, you can think about those things in advance, and you can kind of show your decision makers, obviously with that increased expense, we're raising that, we're raising the total revenue requirement for the system, and we need to have the revenue to kind of match that. So after anticipated capital expenses, another piece of key information was financial condition. And I know some of you all talked about, financial metrics and benchmarking already. So some of these metrics will probably be familiar with to you all. So things like operating ratio, days cash on hand, and debt service coverage ratio. So, this is important information because if you were to show your elected officials, we need a rate increase, and because our operating ratio, has fallen below 1, you can kind of show them some of these visuals, and they can kind of see, okay, yeah, you're right, it has declined. Maybe expenses have steadily increased where your revenues have not, or something like that. And these graphs here are coming from our financial health checkup tool, which takes some inputs from the last 5 years of your audited statements and provides some trends and some metrics of where the fund is and where it has been. And so we will link some of these tools later on and can discuss them a little bit later on. And some of you all have probably talked about them in some of the previous webinars as well. So you can see here, also days cash on hand, you might want to raise rates to increase your cash reserves. Maybe you've had that operating ratio below 1 for a little bit, and you've had to dip in your reserves to make up for that. And so perhaps your decision makers want to be a little more financially secure with the amount of cash you have available to you, and want to increase that number kind of incrementally over time, and a rate increase could help with that. So, if that is the case, looking at the financial condition can help provide some context around that rate increase. And same for debt service coverage ratio. Maybe you kind of took on some debt and it dropped dropped the ratio down a little bit, and perhaps the folks lending you money want to see that number not just at 1, but a bit above 1, maybe 1.2 or 1.25, can kind of vary state by state or who's lending the money, but they want to see that cushion there, that buffer there, and so perhaps that can help provide some context about why a rate increase would be necessary. Another way to kind of communicate some of the financial condition of the system is on our kind of rates dashboard. So you can see here, we did a demo of the rates dashboard earlier this week on the webinar, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in this presentation today. But you can see the financial condition underneath the bill comparison with that cost recovery. So you can see operating ratio, including depreciation. So you can kind of take that and look at the bill comparisons and provide some basic financial conditions just right off the bat without having to do any work besides going to the website that has this information. Another thing that governing boards thought was good information to convey was rate comparisons. And we know rate comparisons are often something that folks want to see. But there's a lot of information that's not always included when you compare rates. So, how many customers are you spreading your expenses across versus maybe your neighbors that have more or less folks? You can see in some of these headlines here, why are OWASA rates higher than Raleigh and Durham? We have the same lake but unequal rates. And so, comparing rates can be useful if you provide the right context and the right information with it, and maybe if you're comparing to the right people. So, the number of customers can be wildly different for each community. Perhaps you are charging for future capital or for, covering depreciation in your rates, and maybe your neighbors aren't, so their rates are a little bit lower. And so that might make a false comparison. Perhaps you are hoping to build up your reserves, and so you're rates are a little bit higher. Also, maybe your customer makeups are a little bit different. Maybe you are mostly residential and have some light commercial, some shops, some restaurants, but maybe there's some folks you're comparing your rates to that have a lot of manufacturing or some industrial customers that kind of allow them to bring in more revenue from some of those sources. And so just making sure we have the right information when comparing rates was important. And so, we have done a survey of Georgia water and wastewater rates, since 2007, and our most recent is in 2019. So we have 97% of rates in our data, and so a lot of you all probably helped with that. So thank you for participating. And we have information on a lot of things. So water, wastewater, irrigation, residential rates, commercial rates, inside and outside rates. And we have these rate structures, and we have computed the bills for a range of consumption points. So at 0, so what is your kind of base charge? And we have starting at 3,000 up to like 15,000, and some increments in between that. And we have some other just information that can be helpful when you're comparing the rates. And some of those tables can look like this, and you can download some of that information from the dashboard website to get a more accurate comparison. If you want to do some of the digging on your own, you can download there. And we will also talk a little bit more about some of the dashboard information in a couple slides. So, when you're comparing the rates, again, back to that financial, some of those financial metrics, you might be able to look at what your rates are and what your cost recovery, what your operating ratio is, and maybe your rates are a bit higher because you have a good operating ratio. So perhaps someone else is a little bit lower and they're not actually covering the cost of depreciation in their rate. So again, that's another bit of context as you're comparing rates. We also have the ability to use comparison groups. So you can see in the dashboard, there's this drop-down list that I've kind of boxed around here. And so the default is to look at all utilities. However, we have a variety of options for you to compare your rates to utilities that have similar that are similar in size, they have similar rate structures, you want to know people around you in a certain location, similar demographics, the type of water, so maybe your surface water, or groundwater, or purchased water, or in financial information. So this allows you to get a little more specific in comparing your rates. And then another key information is you can see a quick analysis of what the effective raising rates would be. We boxed down that area in the bottom, and there's a little slide bar here where you can look at what increasing rates by, this is kind of across the board, 5%, 10%, etc. And you can see what would happen to that bill comparison and what would happen to that bill at a given consumption point. That can be useful, a useful visual when you're communicating rates to folks. So it's a good interactive tool that you can use with your decision makers to kind of see the effective raising rates, as well as when you're comparing your rates to other peers or other utilities. And then again, if you want to download some of that data, you can download those tables and get into some more of the kind of nitty-gritty of the details and data by that button at the bottom that allows you to download it. So those are some information that the governing boards have identified as being useful for them in these conversations around rates and financials. So we also have some strategies to get some buy-in beyond those things. So one approach is to focus on what is good about the water system. which is often overlooked. 99% of the time, everything is fine, and it's that 1% of the time where you're getting a lot of feedback. Maybe something's happened and there's an odor in the water, or the water's a little discolored. That's the time that people are gonna let you know about their water. That 99% of the time when everything is going well, people just don't naturally respond all the time with positive feedback. And so, being able to appeal on what's good can be a good way to get buy-in from, your decision makers, to be able to kind of build off that. And that's what this utility in the Boston area did. You can see here, they're describing it as clean and crisp and refreshing and a great product, which is a good way to support the work that you all have been doing and to build on that, to kind of continue a good quality of service going forward. On the other hand, there's also, you can also focus on what's wrong with your system. And, this can kind of get into an emotional or logical appeal to folks. And, you can kind of say, we aren't doing so well, and that can kind of get some buy-in to kind of start appealing to them about a rate increase, or to talk about rates or financials. And this is, obviously a American report card, not doing so well at that D+, and showing there's an estimated investment needed of $3.6 trillion by the current year. So that's showing just a very showing a very bad picture of what's going on. And we know kind of from a behavioral science perspective that people are more likely to take a risk when they're faced with a potential loss, and when you're more likely to kind of play it safe when you're faced with a potential kind of gain. So being able to appeal on what's wrong can be useful, and it can be also useful to warn of consequences. So you don't want to scare people too much, but you want people to understand that there are real consequences to not investing in your system. And can you afford the crisis if you were not to act? And this can be a useful strategy. And Elsa Marie yesterday talked a bit about asset management, and mentioned this matrix looking at probability of failure and consequence of failure. And so if you need to invest in an asset that has a high risk of failure and the consequence of failure is high, being able to show and talk about those consequences is really important, because you can show that there is that need. And so if something were to happen, if you were to have a consequence or a crisis, what do you do? And we don't want to wish a crisis on anyone, but if that were to happen, you have the people's attention kind of focused on that crisis in that moment. And again, having a crisis is never good, but you can make the best of it by showing the consequences of an action, and showing that there are ways that we can invest in our assets and in our infrastructure and system to help prevent this going forward. An example of this, obviously, that made nationwide news was Flint's water issues, and this is still coming up in the news some today. Again, we don't want any of you all to make nationwide news, but maybe if you have a smaller crisis in your community, you can use that to your advantage to show the consequences of inaction or not maybe properly investing in your system. And as you're talking about rates, and as you're talking about the need for different increases, it's good to use visuals. One of the biggest problems in the water industry is that a lot of the assets are behind walls of facilities or underground, and people just don't have a good grasp of all that goes into providing clean, safe water. And you might have some elected officials who don't know much of the technical details about the water industry, but a layperson can understand this picture here, and know that a rusty kind of beat up pipe is not the best. And that's the reality for a lot of folks, unfortunately. And being able to provide some visuals of the system can help you get some buy-in. In addition, talking about some of the numbers can help put things into scope and scale for everyone. So this is from a utility, and this kind of shows the annual improvement budget for the water system being $226,000, with the total value of the water system being a little over 315 million. Excuse me. And what the utility was trying to do here is trying to frame it in a way, asking their elected officials, if they wanted to take almost 1,400 years to replace the system's assets at this rate, or if they're willing to invest more going forward, and just trying to put those numbers into context and into the scope of everything. Another way, if you all have identified rate setting objectives, I know you all in some of the previous webinars probably heard about some of these rate setting objectives from Elsa Marie and those conversations about, rate setting and those conversations. But, if you have identified, like a lot of folks have, that full cost recovery is important for the system to be self-sufficient financially, being able to kind of go back to that objective when you're talking about rates, you can say, okay, if this is a goal and an objective of our water fund, we need to have the proper rates in order to do so. Another common objective of water systems is maintaining affordability. And some folks, whenever there's a rate increase, a lot of folks, rightly so, are worried about the impact that would have on some people who might not be able to afford it. And you kind of talk about this in a lot of ways. If you were to have smaller incremental rate increases, that might be actually more affordable for those customers than in the long run. If you were to defer maintenance, maybe you would have to end up 10 years later having some very large rate increase when something goes wrong. And so trying to kind of frame that in a way for your benefit can be useful, whether you're talking about full cost recovery or maintaining affordability. And so while some of the things that we mentioned kind of directly related to talking to elected officials, some of those things, especially when you're talking about the numbers or the visuals or warning of consequences, a lot of those things have they translate to communicating with customers. We'll talk about a couple more things here. So, rates are the primary way that, water systems communicate with the customers. And so, some folks include just the bare minimum on their rates. So, the billing information and usage information. And, some folks, will include some other information, whether it be about conservation measures or different ways that they might be able to get involved in a conversation. So back to those key factors that we talked about earlier in the presentation, public involvement was one of them that the survey found as being important for a successful rate request and a successful rate conversation. So we asked a number of questions about the rate adoption process that included public involvement. Like to what level were the stakeholders and public involved? And the survey results were pretty interesting regarding public involvement. And the results indicated that the more the public was involved in the process, the more likely the rate increase was approved. So you can see on the x-axis, the options were, how is the public involved? Not at all, minimally, active outreach by local government, and then the most being public participated in regular and special meetings on the rate adjustment. and that the percentage of the likelihood of the rate adjustment being approved steadily increased the more the public was involved, which is pretty interesting. And then in addition, the results indicated that when the public was involved in the process, the magnitude of the rate increase that was approved was higher. So, being able to be transparent about why you need a rate increase and, being able to show all of the reasons why you need an increase can help you. And if you have the public involved, and if the public understand and have some buy-in about why there's a rate increase, elected officials are going to be much more likely to get on board because they're not going to get as much negative feedback from the public since they're more kind of on board with things, which is really helpful. Oh, excuse me. So we also have some things with customer to communicate with customers. So we each oftentimes have mission statements. And so, that might be something that has been developed, decades ago and is buried on a website or buried in a document. And, everyone kind of needs to know where the organization is headed, and, everyone needs to be on the same page about how you all are trying to communicate to the public from the bare minimum of a mission statement. So some folks might have a mission statement, but not even know, what it is. So, what makes a good mission statement? And a good mission statement uses language that customers use and doesn't get tied up with jargon or technical language. It's concise. It's not long and rambling, so it's clear. It sounds good when you say it out loud. It's not full of clauses that are hard to say or different legal information. It's memorable. It's not forgettable. It's specific and it's not vague. It's actionable and cannot, as opposed to not being able to be quantified. And the actionable is really important because, if you can kind of go back to your mission statement and use that as a way to justify a rate increase, then you kind of have some action items there that you can kind of justify that rate increase with. So a water mission statement that we'll look at here, says we provide a safe, reliable, high quality water supply with superior service and value. And while a lot of you probably have, probably strive to do these things, this group and this organization is trying to make that their mission statement so everyone knows that, and perhaps they could go tie that language back when they're going to a rate increase and talking to their customers and talking with their elected officials and saying, to do this, we need to be able to adequately invest in our system. And then another one here that's a bit longer says, to assure responsive customer service, provide reliable, high quality, affordable, and sustainable water supply, wastewater collection and treatment and reuse system, and support a healthy, environmentally sustainable, and economically viable community. And so this one, touches on not only the quality of service and the environmental implications, but also ties on the economic value that the system has to the community. And with that as a high level mission and mission statement and goals for the system, they can go back to their customers or kind of use that language as they're talking about rates and financials to kind of justify their vision for the system and their vision for that, how that rate increase can help play out that mission statement. And so be thinking about some of those things for yourself and for your own system. Maybe you do have that mission statement that you kind of can go back to, but maybe you don't, and maybe it's not used as much. So perhaps having some strong language can help in that conversation. So again, we have some additional tools. We mentioned some of these on the presentation today, and we have some of these tools on our website at UNC SOG, but we also have some tools on the Environmental Finance Network page that we have up here.
Stephen, before we move on
before I go to more of the resources, Shadi, did folks have questions?
Yes, we have at least one question right now, but I want to remind everybody to submit your questions in the questions box because Stephen is going to be wrapping up this webinar. We want to make sure that we're answering your questions. So please submit those. In the meantime, Stephen, the question about information sharing when the utility staff is presenting to the board. Question is, what was the, I guess you were giving an example of what information was being shared in a particular case. What was the information not shared? The information that was not shared because it was too time consuming, or was it because the communicator, the utility staff or consultant chose not to share that information because they believed it was not most important information to convey to the utility board or the governing body? So when do you decide what not to share?
Yeah, I think that that in that kind of list of information, that first list of information was from more of the staff that was sharing. They're identifying, here is the information that we provided to our governing board, and then that highlighted list was what the governing board said that they found most useful. But I think about what information to include and what not to include is, once you probably build a better relationship or have that already existing relationship with your decision makers, being able to provide a high level, starting off with a high level of the information that you need. So, if you're doing a rate increase because you have some anticipated capital needs, being able to say, here's where we are today, here's what the impact of these future capital projects would be, and here's what an option for a rates would need to be to meet that those future capital needs. Being able to provide some high level information first is probably most important, because a lot of officials probably might not want to get into the weeds of things, but if they do have a good understanding, being able to kind of then dig deeper and provide more information once requested might be a good way to go. But probably keeping it high level first can be better than providing too much information and people kind of drowning in it and not being as engaged with it. Daddy, did you have anything to add there?
I think you hit the most important part, which is understanding, having that rapport with the governing body will help you understand what information they're looking for. The other thing to keep in mind too is just kind of what's the background and what's the personality type of each of the board members. Do you have a board that really likes to look at the numbers? Or do you have a board that just prefers that they just get the general sense of things? They will trust you with the numbers. You just tell them if you're doing well or not. And then you don't need to share quite as much of the details. So it really depends on the makeup of your boards as far as determining what's important to share with them and what's not. And you can also, honestly, you can just ask them. We're happy to provide tables. We can show you the dashboard. We can show you all these things. Which of these pieces of information would you like in the board meeting? Now, with some boards, they're busier than others. They're dealing with, if they're a municipal council, for example, they've got other departments to manage. But if you're an authority and the board's only role is managing the water system, then they may have more time to dig into some of the details. So understanding what the makeup of the board is will be helpful, and then depending on kind of what information they're asking for as well. But I think that if you're not sure, then sometimes less is more, as long as you're communicating that main message that we're not doing very well. Well, if they have questions what that means, they'll ask you, and then you can bring in more information, piece by piece, so you're not overwhelming the board with a lot of information from the get-go. Stephen, we don't have any more questions right now, so please keep on going. But again, everybody, please submit your questions in the questions box.
Yeah, and I do want to kind of reiterate, if you have also questions that come after we, in this conversation and during this presentation, in a couple slides, we'll see some contact information for Shadi and myself, and we'd both be happy to follow up with you. And so, we also have these funding tables. So as you're talking about rate increases, maybe that rate increase is due to taking on some sort of loan or some sort of loan grant combination. But if you're looking at, different funding avenues, we have on our EFCN network or Environmental Finance Center network page, we have under the resources tab an area for funding source by state. So you'll have some Georgia specific funding programs, as well as some links to those programs with some contact information as well, and a kind of high level overview of what those programs are for. So if you do have, if you have some needs, but you're not sure how to fund them, this might be a good starting point as well. And we talked about some of these tools in the presentation today, but definitely, we have a lot of tools around, rates analysis or financial health and financial metrics and affordability analysis. And you can check out the website here and get a quick sense of what the tool is, and then you'll be able to download it from our website and kind of get going with that and use the steps to fill it out. We also, like we talked about, have the dashboard, which can be very useful when you're talking to customers and to decision makers, being able to just pull up on the fly how your bills compare, what your cost recovery is, what your affordability kind of numbers are within the percent MXI kind of conversation, can be a really useful tool to kind of visualize all those numbers together. Another tool that I kind of mentioned, that financial health checkup tool that I'm sure some of you all talked about some of these things in the other webinars, but I've found in my work with systems is, the graphs from this tool, a lot of elected officials like, because they can clearly see, where the fund has been and how it's trending, and get those it's just straight numbers off the audits, and that can be useful for them. Another really a good tool that we find is really useful for systems is that wastewater rates analysis model. And we again find that one of the outputs that a lot of folks really like is what we see here, is that kind of 5-year window of what current rates are versus what maybe some alternative rates are as they compare to the expenses, with a kind of a quick cash flow below it showing what's going on in the graph. But those visuals, I think, are really helpful when you're having those conversations with elected officials and with customers, because you might get lost in the numbers, but the visuals is pretty clear. And then to see the impact of a rate increase, you could always look at that affordability assessment, and we have a tool to do that. And it kind of takes your rates and compares it to some census data and looks at some different income buckets. So if you are concerned with some lower income folks and what that would a rate increase would how that would impact them, we can do this at the income level, and look at some buckets there and look at some socioeconomic indicators. In addition, we have a blog where we write about a lot of relevant environmental finance topics. Recently, the past several months, we've been doing a lot about the impacts of COVID and those sorts of things. So we try to keep it relevant to what folks are dealing with today. And then we also want to make you informed of our technical assistance. So we do provide advising and assistance to small water systems, so the folks serving fewer than 10,000 folks at no cost. And we can help you as you're having these conversations with your decision makers with any of those tools that we discussed. We can do a variety of things here. And so we can do a quick poll kind of saying, would you like assistance from us? And so if you answer yes, contact us soon, we will get on that. If you want us to contact you at a later date, we can do that as well. Or maybe you don't need assistance. But by clicking yes here, we can ensure that we follow up with you sooner than later. In addition, if you don't answer yes today but want assistance, we have our contact information on the slides, and you can follow up with one of us, and we'll be sure to be in touch with you.
Thank you. And I have we've asked this question the past 2 webinars as well. If you've already answered yes to one of those 2, we'll follow up. But this is really there for folks who this might be their first webinar with us. So please submit. I think we've got enough responses. I'm going to close it out. Actually, we're getting a few more. All right. So we are done with that poll. Stephen, back to you. And I don't have any more questions right now.
Alrighty, well, here is our contact information. And you know, if something comes up or you want some more information about a topic that we discussed today, feel free, and we'll be happy to talk about that. And if you said that if you responded saying that you would like some assistance, we will be able to follow up with you, and we look forward to continuing that relationship with you all. And again, I want to thank folks for joining us today and joining us earlier this week if you participated in those. So thank you for that, and we will be in touch with you all who said you wanted assistance. Shadi, do you have anything else to add?
Well, thank you, Stephen, for presenting this, and thank you everybody for joining us. I also want to thank GEFA for having us present these webinars for you all. This is the last one. This concludes our webinar series for Georgia. We're happy to work with you one-on-one. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to do that. Feel free to contact us at any point. We really appreciate all the work that you're doing as well for your customers, especially during the very difficult time with COVID, having to try to manage revenue stresses as well as changes to how you interact with customers. So we know it's a busy time, it's a difficult time. We appreciate everybody's work and how important water systems are to everybody at this time. So thank you, everybody, and this concludes our series.